Well, hello there. This is Mr. Bostic, and I thought we might take a few minutes to talk about El Camino de Santiago, or the Way of St. James. When I first got to Spain in the mid 90s, I had actually never heard of the Camino, and which is a little surprising considering James is my name. But I learned quite a lot about it and had a chance to go visit Santiago a few weeks after I first got to Spain. So I thought this might be kind of an interesting thing to explore. As I include this map here because, as you can see, these routes that travel all over Europe are traditional routes that have been used since before the year 1000 for people to come and visit the Tomb of the Apostle. And this historic pilgrimage has done quite a lot, in fact, to create a sense of common European culture. And so let's go ahead and get started. Among the three greatest medieval pilgrimage routes, there were really three main destinations. The first and holiest, of course, was to Jerusalem. In Spanish tradition and in general Latinate tradition, people who pilgrimed to Jerusalem were called palmeros. Those who went to Rome, the second most common place of pilgrimage, are called romeros, and those who went to Santiago were called peregrinos. Now, if you look in a Spanish dictionary these days, the general word for pilgrim is peregrino, and that gives you a little bit of a hint as to how common and how foundational this pilgrimage was. Among all of the different routes that are possible and traditional from various different places, I mean, ultimately, people's pilgrimage routes began at their doorstep, and they would continue walking until they joined into major routes. But in Spain, if you hear El Camino, the principal route is called the Camino Frances, or the French route, which begins in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and this was the possible secondary entry here, also along the Pyrenees, and passes through a number of very famous sites where pilgrims would stay. Many of them, some of the major cities of Spain, from Pamplona, which is the capital of the former Kingdom of Navarre and now the region of Navarre, to Burgos, which was at the time of Columbus used by Ferdinand and Isabel as capital of Spain, to Leon, another regional capital of Spain, and many other medium to smaller sites along the way. Just an idea of distance from the beginning of that route in Spain, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, which is leaving France, just about to enter Spain. You get this, very famously, people pass this sign of Santiago de Compostela. This is a bit into the Spanish path, and the total route is about 800 kilometers, or about 500 miles. Quite a long way to walk. Most people, the traditional pilgrim, would walk. In the Middle Ages, they might, if they were wealthy enough, take a horse or a cart. These days, some of the accepted alternatives are to ride a bicycle, for example, or sometimes ride a horse or a mule. But most people walk, and if they do the whole Camino, it takes around a month, unless one is going quite quickly. Throughout the path, it's been well marked, and especially there's been a revival in the last number of decades, and the path is marked through cities and through the countryside with shells, or the Concha, as you see here, or with flechas, which are arrows, these yellow arrows. You can see them all up and down the path. The Concha is a traditional symbol of pilgrimage. Here you see a number of them with the cross of St. James, which is a red cross that looks like a sword. And that has to do with the history of St. James in Spain, and some particular events that, in fact, have made James one of the patron saints of Spain. Here we see the Alto del Perdón, which is just past Pamplona. These are large steel structures on a very windy hill, depicting this traditional pilgrimage of many people on foot, some on donkeys, and once again, right along the path of the Camino that pilgrims traverse and pass through. There's all kinds of countryside. Of course, many people think, when they think of Spain, they think of the kind of sere, more sort of desertous kind of climate you can find in places in the south. But in the north, where the Camino passes, Many areas are green. There's a lot of rainfall throughout the year, and you see a really wide variety of terrains from passages that look like this to other areas. This is a region called the Meseta, which is a little further along the path, which tends to be broad and open. It's sort of wheat country, but quite empty, and with long stretches between cities. And pilgrims, I should say, refer to this as sort of a difficult but sort of an introspective time along the Camino. One of the major highlights, or perhaps highlights isn't the best word, but one of the major things that people encounter along the way is this famous Cruz de Hierro, which Iron Cross, which is mounted, as you can see, way above a hill. And the tradition is for people to bring a small item or a small stone along the way to symbolize the things that they are spiritually carrying, and to come to this cross and to excuse me, to leave them there as a token of dropping their burdens, and in a prayerful sense, and leaving their burdens behind them as they progress along the path of the Camino. And we see, you're passing. Spain is quite mountainous. It's one of the most mountainous countries in Europe, and some of these paths are, going up and down quite a lot in elevation. Eventually, of course, arriving at Santiago. And this is a famous vista from a nearby hill of the cathedral itself. The front of the cathedral has received a more recent Baroque facade, but the original cathedral was older. It was Romanesque and dates before the time of Gothic even. And you can see, once entering the cathedral, a number of those kind of details. And we see it a little more up close. And around here, we see a famous statue of St. James himself. Of course, there are many such statues or similar statues throughout Santiago and along the path. Inside the cathedral and above the altar, we see here another very famous statue of Santiago that pilgrims traditionally would come up to, and with a stairway from behind, and come up behind the statue and embrace the apostle. And also, down below in a crypt, the remains of St. James themselves, the remains themselves of St. James here in this silver reliquary with a small altar in front that pilgrims can come and visit and pray alongside the apostle. One of the traditions is at the Pilgrim's Mass is to have the Botafumeiro, which is this large incense burner, which it takes, as you can see this crowd over here, gentlemen, I think 6 to 8 gentlemen here pulling on the ropes, using their whole body weight to swing this massive silver incense burner, which would swing almost all the way up to the ceiling, left and right, and throughout the whole cathedral. That's a large space. The tradition says that originally this was to counteract some of the smell from pilgrims who had been walking for a long while and didn't exactly smell so great after such a long journey. One of the highlights of the route is along the way, pilgrims, to document their travels, have a pilgrim passport, and they get stamps along the path to prove that they have actually been in these places and actually taken part in the pilgrimage, and not just sort of zipped in a modern way from one area to the next. And this has to be turned in to be able to get the credential, which pilgrims like to try to receive at the end here, to document the fact that they in fact have gone on this pilgrimage, and at a point in their life. And it's there's usually quite a long line of pilgrims looking to turn in their passport for this credential. The pilgrimage itself went through a long period of decline, especially after the late 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. But from the late part of the 1900s, here you can see from the 1980s, there's been a very sharp incline in people that are going on the Camino, and many of them for what they would call spiritual rather than religious purposes. There are a lot of people who kind of see this as a kind of cosmic journey. That one of the traditions is that following the way of St. James is following the path of the Milky Way, the Compostela. People disagree about the origin of the name. Some people say that it comes from Compostelae, which is a field of stars. And of course, out way far away from any cities, walking along the pilgrimage routes, many people would walk, instead of walking in the heat of the day, they would walk in other hours, and you'd see, following kind of the path of the Milky Way. The others say that it's from compostalum, which is the Latin term for a burial site, which is what had been there, a Roman burial site at the place that St. James' remains were discovered. So, at any rate, there are a lot of different motives people have for going on the Camino these days. But just from 1986, about 10 years before I was there, until 2016, a few years ago, you can see there's been quite a sharp increase. And the reason for these particular spike years is that every so often, when the saint's feast day hits a Sunday, there is a plenary indulgence, a full indulgence connected to doing the pilgrimage. So on those years, they tend to get a lot more pilgrims undertaking the journey. You can see here also, in terms of recent pop cultural references, a number of recent books have and movies have touted and popularized knowledge about the Camino that, in a way that hadn't happened in previous, decades, or really for a few centuries. Whether it's The Alchemist or The Pilgrimage, both by Paulo Coelho, or Martin Sheen's movie The Way, which is a shortening of El Camino. It's once again the Way of St. James, but it's not just modern references. These are somewhat recent as well, of course, but there's some surprising and subtle references in famous works of literature, especially most obviously in the Snarls Horizons, which most people associate with other activities, partying really around the running of the bulls in Pamplona. But throughout that work, there's a following of the path of St. James in a kind of aborted way. And there's all kinds of references to pilgrimages and to churches, and direct references, the main protagonist going into a church and praying and wishing he were a better Catholic. And there's an underlying preoccupation with that. And of course, for the same author, Hemingway, The Old Man of the Sea is a much more direct reference. The main character's name is Santiago, and he promises that if he's able to catch the big fish, he will dedicate it to Our Lady. Of course, this is taking place in the New World, but this is our representation of Our Lady that herself is connected to the tradition of Santiago. So there are all kinds of direct, or really, not so subtle references in The Old Man and the Sea. And even in The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, there are a number of different references, whether it's small things such as the fact that Bilbao, a city in northern Spain, is in a famous capital of one of those northern regions, not far off, in fact, from the Camino. Bilbao, if you're there and you live there, the way they pronounce the name is Bilbo, and it's an obvious connection to The Hobbit. And beyond that, in the Lord of the Rings in general, and Tolkien's world in general, there's an interesting resonance with Gandalf. And here we can see Gandalf is called the Great Pilgrim, and you can see in this, just in the way he's positioned, walking with a staff. There's quite a similarity to the way that St. James is depicted as a pilgrim. Obviously the cloak, the hood, a walking staff, which is commonly used by people walking in varied terrains. Here you see a number of different depictions, from medieval statues and some later art to a pilgrim from the 1700s. Santiago is also depicted as Matamoros, which means the Moor Slayer, because by tradition Santiago appeared in a battle in which, the Battle of Clavijo, in which the Christians were outnumbered, and he appeared on a white horse and began routing the opponents and won the day, helped the Christians win the day. And since then, he has been the patron of Spain, one of the main patrons, one of the, I believe, two patrons of Spain. So here you can see, once again, on that statue on the top of the cathedral, a strong similarity between how Gandalf is depicted and how St. James is depicted. So much so that this holy medal, which is a medal, in fact, from Santiago, from one of the holy years, in some ways looks almost more like the depiction of Gandalf than this statue. And it's something not often referenced.